The views expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination, other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media, is strictly prohibited. So today our panel will continue our conversation with our special guest, Glenn Kirschner, and we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the disturbing things that we're seeing as it relates to the judicial system in the United States. And we're going to ask, if there was something that could be changed about the judicial system, what would Glenn's first priority be? We're also going to be talking a little bit about the Department of Justice, and we're going to ask ourselves, should the Department of Justice remain under the executive branch, or should it be moved to the judicial branch? It's an interesting conversation, so let's listen in.
I think he's trying to hurry this along with the declaration or the executive order that he signed yesterday, I guess it was, that says that the president and the U.S. Attorney General are the sole arbiters of what is and what is not law.
Yeah, and he's wrong about that, Scott. I agree. He's trying to hasten it along. But you know what I heard when I read that? I heard Richard Nixon saying, if the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, guess what? When Donald Trump says he who saves his country violates no law or issues this new ridiculous executive order, I can only hope he meets with the same political fate as Richard Nixon, because that's what should happen. And I think the courts have recognized, and I hope the Supreme Court justices will recognize when they take up the first case that comes out of these executive orders, that this cannot stand, because this is dictatorial. This is an autocracy. And, this is not the way the United States wants to end up. So, we're keeping our fingers crossed, but more importantly, we're trying to mobilize in every way we can to try to make sure we put on all the pressure that we can to avoid lapsing into dictatorship.
And I think it's almost like Susan Collins hopeful that the Supreme Court is going to do the right thing here after they had the chance to do it when he wasn't in office and they granted him immunity. I don't share your optimism, I guess, is the way I'm looking at it. I hope people continue to take to the streets to let their voices be heard. Maybe it has some meaning for some authority figure up there, whether it's in Congress or the court. But I think that they've set the ground. They've set sail for where they're going, and this is where they're going.
And if the Supreme Court wants to continue down this path of unrestricted absolute power of the president, they do so at their own peril, because the minute a Supreme Court justice does something Donald Trump doesn't like, he can summarily order them detained, and there is no remedy. So I would think the Supreme Court would enjoy its co-equal branch of government status and power. Now, the Congress doesn't seem to care about its co-equal branch of government status and power, because they have laid down and let Donald Trump walk all over them. So, which I am always surprised at how people are willing to do things that ultimately work to their own detriment and disadvantage in service to dear leader. I still don't understand that, and probably never will.
Glenn, in our last episode, you were talking about some of the Supreme Court. You were talking about the justice system, the U.S. Marshal system. I think it shows in many ways that the founding fathers, when they first wrote the Constitution, the Supreme Court was kind of an afterthought. It really wasn't. It wasn't until like 1803 that the Supreme Court truly, came into its to the Marbury decision, that it came into its own. We see that the judicial system has some holes in it. If you were to fix it, if I was to say, all right, Glenn, I want you to fix the judicial system of the United States, where would you start, and what would be your priorities?
Oh, I would start at the Supreme Court, because we've got rot at the top. And I take no pleasure in saying that. But when we see these opinions that come out that are contrary to the Constitution, I mean, the 14th Amendment, Section 3 says If you take an oath of office to support the Constitution, and you thereafter engage in insurrection by operation of the Constitution, you are disqualified from holding any office in the future unless Congress, by 2/3 in both houses, removes the disability. That's plain, that's clear. I can read English. And yet they decided a case that is entirely contrary to that. Again, the presidential immunity case, the Constitution says you must take care as a president that the laws of the nation be faithfully executed. Violating the law with impunity is the exact opposite of taking care that the laws of the nation be faithfully executed. The impeachment judgment clause says even if a president is impeached by the House and convicted on that article of impeachment in the Senate, he can still be prosecuted for the same conduct. In other words, there's no quasi-double jeopardy implications. And again, the Supreme Court just threw all of that out, rewrote the Constitution, and decided the presidential immunity case contrary to it. So what would I do? I would start with the rot at the top. There has to be a mandatory enforceable code of ethics for Supreme Court justices. There is none, zero. They can crime at their pleasure. They can engage in all the unethical conflict behavior that they want, and there's no mandatory code of ethics through which they can be disciplined. There is, of course, impeachment and removal of federal judges, but that almost never happens. I also would, this isn't a reform so much, because I kind of like the balance that has been struck, the co-equal branches of government and the checks and balances of one against another. But you have to be willing to use the tools of your branch of government to make those checks and balances work. So when Supreme Court justices violate the law, like mandatory financial disclosure laws, I had to file my financial disclosure form every year for 30 years. It was the bane of my existence. But you know what? I scrutinized it. I didn't want a decimal point out of place in case I was misleading somebody, even unintentionally. These folks, some of them on the Supreme Court, do not give a rat's you know what about financial disclosure laws, violate them happily. The Department of Justice should be investigating those violations of federal law. That's the executive branch. The Congress should be holding hearings, including impeachment inquiries regarding those violations of law by judges. We just have to apply the tools that each branch of government has rather than laying down. And I don't know that I do believe in increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. Over our nation's history, we've had as few as 5. We've had as many as 10. And 9 is not a magic number. The number of judicial circuits have increased to 13. 13 makes a lot of sense because each judge is supposed to have some supervisory responsibility over one of the federal judicial districts. Some of them have to double up now because we foolishly have not increased the number of Supreme Court justices. We increase the number of federal court judges all the time, trial court judges, appeals court judges. Why? Because the caseloads continue to rise. It's really irresponsible not to keep the Supreme Court in step with the times and, if only for caseload reasons, increase the numbers over times to at least mirror the increase in population and in caseloads that we experience here in the United States. So those are some of the things that I would do to begin to fix the judiciary. And if there were some way to, retool the nomination process so that we were getting truly qualified judges. I don't want to go on too long, but, I use the President Obama practice. And listen, people don't believe that I'm really not much of a political guy. I have voted for Republicans. I've voted for Democrats. I've voted for independents over the course of my life. But, I like the way President Obama approached judicial nominations. He would send the name that he was thinking of putting forward to the American Bar Association. He would ask for their rating, and there are 3 ratings. You're either fully qualified, I think well qualified, qualified, or not qualified. They don't go with unqualified, they go with not qualified. Anytime the ABA came back and told the Obama administration, we've looked at this person, we've gone through their background, they're not qualified, President Obama never appointed a single one of them. The Trump administration, happy to put not qualified judges on the bench, as long as, I guess, the administration perceived they would be loyal to, Trump's priorities. That's no way to run a judicial nomination process. If we could do it in an objective way, I mean, I would think left, right, and center, everybody would want qualified and well-qualified judges, even if they ideologically leaned one way or another. So those are some of the things I would retool.
So would you also consider term limits?
Yeah. Oh, I forgot. There's so much to fix. Yeah, no, I don't see why 15-year term limits is, or, even mandatory retirement age. I mean, law enforcement has it. The FBI, it's 57 or 57 and a half. I know running around after bad guys in the streets is a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, term limits makes sense to me. I don't know why it has to be an appointment for life. We would, obviously have to change some things, but that also makes sense to me.
There was a time, I don't know, it was a few years ago, I guess, when Mark and I were discussing this, and I had the idea that maybe we should move the Department of Justice out of the executive branch and move it to the judiciary. I'm a little worried about that now because of all these Federalist Society judges and the fact that they haven't really shown the greatest sense, really, to me at all in some of these rulings. But having the Department of Justice in the executive branch has become, kind of a nightmare.
Yeah. And I don't know that I would want to move the Department of Justice under the control of the judiciary. It feels like there's a friction, if not a built-in conflict there, when you have prosecutor and judge so closely aligned in the same branch of government. I would think the defense bar would be up in arms, like, okay, it used to be just the executive branch, the prosecutors against us, and we had the judge as an independent arbiter, referee, but now they're all together against us. Feels a little unfair when you're representing a defendant. What I have advocated for, and I think makes some sense, is having a full-time, permanently staffed independent counsel's office in the executive branch that is immune from politics. Now, I will say immune from politics, and I think people can rightly say, you're out of your mind. Nothing is immune from politics. I don't disagree with that. But remember when we had the old independent counsel law, which lapsed decades ago, there was much more judicial involvement and control of independent counsel than there is of special counsel now, because special counsel is still under largely the control of the attorney general, therefore under the control of the president. But I do think an independent counsel's office, truly independent of the executive branch, but not part of the judicial branch, makes some sense to me, because there are so many politically fraught cases, either because the defendant is a political person or because the issue regarding the crimes that have been committed by folks have political or ideological aspects to them. I think a full-time, permanently staffed independent counsel's office, to me, makes some sense.
I'd go with that.
And we will continue our conversation with our guest, Glenn Kirschner, in our next episode. We hope you join us. The Nova Society is a production of Nova Society Media, a division of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our production partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Apple iTunes, the largest source of podcasts and music on the internet, Spotify, the most popular platform for the Nova Society, and iHeartRadio, your source for all things music and podcasting. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms listed in our description. We'd also like to thank all of our listeners. Without your support, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a question or a comment, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. So for Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Scott Kirschner, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Remember, the true power in society is knowledge. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next time. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social-political issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. The Phoenix Research Group is a division of the Phoenix Research Institute, the producer of the Nova Society podcast.